314,000 new infections in a single day. It's the worst coronavirus outbreak for any country. India's hospitals are close to collapse. They're running out of medication and oxygen. 2,000 people died on Wednesday alone. India had come off relatively lightly during the pandemic, but the number of infections has rocketed in recent weeks.
Why is the big question? Some doctors blame more infectious variants. Others point to loose restrictions and people letting down their guard after hearing about the vaccine or following India's fairly unscathed brush with the first wave. We'll talk to an expert in Delhi in a moment. First, this report.
Many in India thought they had got the better of the pandemic. But now the country is being overwhelmed by a devastating new wave. No city is as badly hit as Delhi. As cases explode, hospitals there are at breaking point. Some patients are forced to share a bed. And there's an acute shortage of oxygen. The city's chief minister says the system has reached its limits.
जो कोरोना के लिए बेड रिजर्व हैं.
The beds for COVID-19 patients are filling up rapidly. Patients are being admitted to the hospitals very quickly. Intensive care beds are in short supply, and less than 100 ICU beds are available in Delhi. Authorities in Delhi had already imposed a lockdown over the weekend, ordering all but essential services to close. Local leaders hope the decision to step up the measures will help to mitigate the crisis. Some welcome the restrictions, but others fear if they're not allowed to work, the consequences could be drastic. It is essential that there's a lockdown here because right now the virus is spreading a lot. The problem with the lockdown is us daily wage earners who get 100 to 300 rupees a day. Where will we go? How will we eat? Where will we sleep? Is the government going to come and give us this daily wage? But now, with 1 in 3 tests in Delhi turning out positive, the government says it must act to avert a greater disaster. The fear is that the surge in cases is due to a new, more infectious variant of the virus. They're calling on people to be more disciplined about sticking to the rules. But critics are also asking why religious festivals and political rallies that are fueling cases as participants return to cities like Delhi are still being allowed to go ahead. For tens of thousands of families, such questions come too late. And if current trends persist, then many more will find themselves in the same tragic situation.
Rajiv Dasgupta is chair of the Centre of Social Medicine and Community Health at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Just how tragic is the situation? What have you been experiencing?
Well, in short, the situation is extremely distressing, particularly for those who require bed or oxygen support or intensive care support. It is also very troubling given that the number of cases are continuing to rise, and as the report just said, the test positivity rate is nearly 30%. That goes on to show that this trend is going to continue for some foreseeable weeks.
The numbers are absolutely awful. Let's just take a little look at them. Out of 1.5 billion people, there have been over 15 million cases and more than 265,000 infections a day. What's your explanation?
Well, the most common explanation is one of negligence or complacency, but that's not the entire explanation, because even in the first phase, it's not that the preventive behaviors or preventive practices were absolutely top order. They weren't. As very limited behavioral surveys, and the fact is that the surveys were limited, has shown. What is important is that the cases began to rise coinciding with the import of the UK strain, first identified in the last week of December. which significantly led to rise in the northern Indian state of Punjab, as well as identification of local homegrown variants, the B1617 as we now know, which later went on to become the double mutant as it's popularly known as. The point is that these two have spread incredibly fast and have simply outstripped the health services.
What about some of these political rallies and festivals turning into so-called super spreader events? I mean, what's to celebrate when so many people are dying?
Now, the fact that the Disaster Management Act, the National Disaster Management Act, remains in force in the country belies explanations why events of this scale were actually happening, allowed by the local administrations. In fact, several of the medical associations, doctors' bodies have already written to the Election Commission of India, drawing attention to these rallies, and it's only belatedly, if I may, the Election Commission put its foot down, limiting it to 500 per congregation.
So
but
who's to blame here? Is it the government or is it the people who decide to go along to these rallies and events?
Well, both certainly, because the Disaster Management Act is in force. There's a very detailed standard operating procedure for various congregations, whether it's a wedding, whether it's a cremation, how many seats, for example, can be occupied in a cinema hall, how many seats can be filled up in a bus, how many have to be empty in a cafe, and so on and so forth. So there is no dearth of these details of these procedures.
Rajib, what happened to lessons learned from the first wave and from so many other places that have had their third or fourth waves? This is only the second wave, and we're talking about the biggest rise in infections worldwide.
Well, the experience both from this pandemic in other countries as well as earlier influenza pandemics is that the second wave almost inevitably is very big, and that's largely because young adults get affected, which is exactly the feature here. In the earlier phase in February, in some of the districts of Maharashtra, the Western Indian state, including the financial capital Mumbai, in some of these states, the test positivity rate has been as high as 50%, in fact 50% plus. That goes on to show that it is the variant spreading very fast, and though not necessarily more fatal, but because they're more transmissible, led to a burst of cases which completely outstripped medical services, and therefore leading to some excess mortality.
Rajib, just briefly and finally, can you offer Indians watching our show today some sort of hope? Well, the state and the courts have often taken a contrarian position of lives versus livelihoods. The Supreme Court today also took suo motu cognizance of that, urging the government to consider it as a national emergency. And we hope that these emergency measures would be put in pretty fast. Both state and central governments and local bodies have gone back to their drawing boards, but it could still take a couple of weeks perhaps to offer some succor. Rajib Dasgupta, thank you very much for being on the show today, joining us from Delhi there.
Thank you.
And time to hand you over to our very own Derek Williams. He's got a viewer question on, you guessed it, vaccines.
Is the first dose of a vaccine different from the second one?
Almost all of the dozen or so vaccines now going into arms around the world are given in 2 doses, with the recommended interval between them, depending on the vaccine, between 2 and 12 weeks. The ways the different vaccines provoke an immune response vary. Some are based on messenger RNA that causes your cells to make the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. Others smuggle the same genetic information into the body packed in harmless adenoviruses that act like taxis into your cells, while some of the Chinese vaccines employ a more traditional platform, a full version of the coronavirus that's been inactivated. In nearly all of the 2-dose vaccines, the 2 shots administered are identical, though there is an exception to that rule. The doses of the Russian Sputnik V vaccine are made with two different adenoviruses that cause colds, although both have been genetically engineered to carry the same SARS-CoV-2 spike protein genes. The vaccine was designed that way to ensure that the booster shot, so the second one, would work even if recipients developed a strong immune response to the carrier virus in the first dose. Other trials based on the same principle, which is called heterologous prime boost, they're also now going on with other vaccines. Some of those trials are combining different vaccines in different ways to see whether that might make the immune response to SARS-CoV-2 even stronger or more lasting.
Now, here's something I would